Why did they single her out? Out of all the faces in the mess hall, why her? The question hovered like static in the air that morning, long before anyone touched a tray or filled a cup of coffee. She sat alone, the way she always did, quiet, deliberate, back to the wall, eyes sweeping the room in glances so subtle most would miss them. To the recruits fresh out of training, she was invisible, a contractor, temporary, a woman too ordinary to be worth a second thought. And maybe that was the problem. Ordinary was suspicious. They noticed how she never lingered in conversation, how she cut through the base like water through a channel, flowing, efficient, unbothered. No wasted movement, no nervous laughter. To them, that silence was weakness. To her, it was survival. By the end of the week, whispers trailed her like shadows. Some called her standoffish. Others said she thought she was better than them. None of them knew what the quiet really meant. Not yet. The sun over Fort Red Haven burned pale, bleaching the motor pool and supply yards into harsh light. Forklifts rumbled, crates stacked into perfect grids, boots rang out against concrete in a rhythm as old as the base itself. She moved through it all with the calm certainty of someone who belonged, even though her file said otherwise. To anyone watching closely, and Master Sergeant Cole always watched closely, there were tells. The way she positioned herself near exits, the way her head turned just enough to sweep a room without seeming to, the way her shoulders never slumped, even when she carried crates twice her size. She didn't look like logistics. She looked like someone waiting for something. Had seen soldiers wear disguises before, paperwork that said one thing, scars that said another. He kept his distance, but his instincts didn't lie. Whoever she wasn't here to count boxes. The recruits didn't notice the details. Mason, Troy, Serrano, they noticed only what they wanted to. And what they wanted was a target, someone to test, someone who wouldn't fight back hard enough to embarrass them. So when Mason brushed his shoulder against her in the yard, knocking her clipboard to the concrete, it wasn't an accident. Papers scattered, a pen rolled under a pallet. He kept walking without breaking stride. "Watch where you're going," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. Laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. She bent to pick up her papers, stacking them in order, her movements calm. No heat, no fear, just deliberate precision. She murmured 2 words under her breath. By mistake. Neither submissive nor confrontational. A line in the sand, spoken so evenly it was almost easy to miss. But heard it. He was 20 feet away, pretending to check a manifest, watching the entire collision unfold. He saw Mason glance back with that look, the look of a young man convinced he'd found a weakness, when all he'd done was tug on a wire he couldn't see. Had seen it before. He knew how it ended. The whispers spread fast. By the time breakfast was over, the story had grown legs. In one version, she'd bumped into Mason first. In another, she'd acted like he didn't exist. The recruits laughed, circling their story until it hardened into truth they could believe in. Sipped his coffee, jaw tight. He'd been in the army long enough to know where this was heading. But she gave no sign. She moved through the chow line, sat by the window, and ate like it was any other day. Back to the wall, eyes scanning the exits. When she finished, she stacked her tray neatly, wiped down the table, and left without a word. If silence bothered them, it only made them hungrier. By midweek, Mason and his crew had turned their curiosity into fixation. They lingered in doorways she passed through, let their shoulders brush hers in narrow halls, laughed louder when she was in earshot. They thought they were hunters. She knew they were circling prey they didn't understand. She changed one thing, just one. She stopped avoiding the mess hall at peak hours. It was a concession, a choice. If they wanted to follow, then let them. But she wouldn't surrender her ground. On Thursday night, overheard Mason muttering to outside the motor pool, their voices pitched low, conspiratorial. "No one's that quiet unless they've got something to hide." His reply was careless. "Or she just thinks she's better than us." Either way, they agreed, they were going to find out. Find out, hated those words. They never ended well. Saturday morning brought the opening they'd been waiting for. The mess hall was thinly populated, weekend rotation leaving only a handful of stragglers eating late. She reclaimed her seat near the windows, tray in front of her, black coffee steaming against the pale light, scrambled eggs cooling under the heat lamp glow. She ate slowly, methodically, fork rising and falling with the same steady rhythm as her breath. That was when Mason spotted her. His conversation with Troy and faltered. His expression sharpened, hungry. They didn't need to say it aloud. A week of circling had led to this moment. They entered together not in formation but close enough to feel like a wall. Mason led, shadowing his side. Troy and widened the line, hung back just enough to block the side exit. To an outsider, they were just 5 men walking into a cafeteria. To her, it was a net closing. She didn't tense, she didn't even look up. Her fork lifted, her gaze flicked across them in fragments, mapping positions the way a cartographer maps a coastline. Distance to the MPs finishing their late breakfast, the angle of the serving line, the width of the nearest exit, every detail logged. No panic, just readiness. Mason reached her table first. "Morning," he said, voice calm but pitched to carry. She sipped her coffee. "Morning." Leaned against the chair opposite hers. "We were just talking about you." Her reply was cool. "Can't imagine why." Mason slid into the seat without asking, elbows on the table. "Because you're a mystery, and mysteries need solving." Her eyes met his, steady. "You don't want to know the real me." Chuckled. "That's the problem. You think you get to decide how this goes." Behind her, stance shifted, not casual anymore. Weight on the balls of his feet, ready to close the gap. From the doorway, entered quietly, stopping just inside. He saw it unfolding, felt the tension thicken like smoke. He could intervene then, ended it before it began. But something in him held back. He wanted to see how far Mason was willing to push, and how far she was willing to let him. Mason leaned in, voice low but sharp. "You can walk with us now," or he let the word hang, heavy with threat. Her gaze didn't flinch. "Or what?" A ripple passed through the table. Mason's smirk was strained now, brittle around the edges. Grinned, tapping his knuckles against the surface. "We can make this easy, or messy." Her tone didn't rise. "You're confusing messy with dangerous. They're not the same." The room seemed to still. Even the MPs, half listening from across the hall, turned their heads. A tray clattered in the kitchen, loud in the silence. Troy placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, like he was steering her towards some invisible door. Too soft to draw attention, too firm to be friendly. That was the line. She set her fork down, picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, placed the cup back with precision. Then she removed Troy's hand, not roughly, not enough to alarm anyone beyond their circle. Just a simple grip, a downward twist and release, leaving him staring at his wrist, unsure how she'd broken the contact so easily. Her voice carried, quiet but steady. "You don't want to do that." For a heartbeat, Mason faltered, but the arrogance that had carried him this far refused to back down. "We'll see about that." And, standing in the doorway, felt the inevitability settle over the room like a storm cloud. The countdown had begun. What was she waiting for? That was the question that pressed against the silence in the mess hall. She sat there, calm as still water, while 5 young men closed in around her. To Mason and his crew, her quiet was defiance. To, watching from the doorway, it was something else entirely. A warning. Troy's wrist still tingled where she'd removed his hand. He rubbed at it, confused, but Mason leaned forward, forcing the moment past. "Last chance, walk with us, or we make you wish you had." She didn't move, didn't rise to meet the threat. She only looked at him, her gaze flat, level, unblinking. "You've already decided what you're going to do. Get on with it." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Their sharpness cut deeper than a shout ever could. For Mason, it was a challenge he couldn't step back from. For the others, it was permission. The 5-man net closed in. Chairs scraped. Boots shifted. The air thinned with the kind of tension you feel in your bones before a storm breaks. And then movement. His hand reached for her shoulder. The instant his fingers brushed fabric, she struck. Her elbow snapped backward, sharp and practiced, driving into the soft gap under his ribs. His breath exploded from his lungs in a strangled grunt, and he stumbled back, eyes wide in shock. At the same moment, her right knee shot up under the edge of the table, catching Mason as he started to rise. The crack of cartilage echoed under the fluorescent lights. His head snapped back, blood already spilling down his face. The table screeched as she shoved it aside. Lunged, but she was already moving, sliding inside his reach, hooking his leg with hers, shoulder slamming into his chest. His own momentum betrayed him. He spun sideways, crashing into, the two of them collapsing in a tangle of limbs and curses. Troy came next, charging low, trying to wrap her waist. She pivoted, planted her right foot, and drove the heel of her palm into his jaw. The impact sent his head snapping back, dropping him hard to his knees. Tried again, half recovered, fury overtaking caution. She caught his arm, twisted at the elbow, and forced him down across an overturned chair. A sharp strike to the back of his knee left him gasping, pinned. Mason staggered up, blood streaming from his nose, rage burning through his shock. She stepped in, pressed a flat palm to his chest, and shoved him back against the wall, not with fury, with finality. Her other hand hung at her side, loose, ready. 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds, and the mess hall was silent except for the ragged breathing of 5 recruits on the floor. Hadn't moved. He stood in the doorway, stunned, watching the calm aftermath of violence as precise as surgery. He'd seen bar fights, seen scuffles break out during deployments, but never like this. This wasn't rage. This wasn't adrenaline. This was control. Her chest rose and fell evenly, breath measured, no wasted energy. She scanned each man in turn, not to gloat, not even to linger, but to ensure none of them were about to do something foolish. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. Mason spat blood against the wall, his words slurred through swelling lips. "What the hell are you?" She crouched, met his eyes without heat, without triumph, just truth. Petty officer, first class, United States Navy SEAL Team 4, 2 tour in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, 37 confirmed kills, 16 up close. Her voice didn't rise, it carried because it didn't need to. "I'm on medical leave while the Navy decides if my injuries are enough to retire me. I am not a contractor." The weight of her words pressed the room into silence. The MPs in the corner froze, their casual slouch gone in an instant. The kitchen clatter halted. Even, who had suspected for weeks, felt the gravity of her revelation. She straightened, picked up her coffee, drained the last swallow, and set the cup down. "I changed my schedule to avoid you. I stayed out of your way. You decided quiet meant weak. That was your mistake." None of them answered. Lay flat on his back, chest heaving. Sat against a table leg, rubbing his temple. Troy clutched his jaw, dazed. Leaned on an overturned chair, arm cradled against his ribs. Mason slumped against the wall, his face pale beneath the blood. Adjusted her shirt, collected her tray, and walked it to the return line. She rinsed her cup, stacked the silverware neatly, placed everything exactly where it belonged. Then she turned and left the mess hall without looking back. The silence she left behind was heavier than the fight. When the MPs finally moved, it was like stepping into a minefield. They scanned the chaos, overturned chairs, spilled food, 5 injured recruits, then looked to the door she had just exited. One let out a low whistle. What the hell happened here? But no one gave a full answer. Mason muttered through blood, stayed on the floor, staring at the ceiling. The others avoided eye contact, their silence an admission stronger than words. By the time word spread, the story was already fractured. Some said she'd snapped. Others swore she'd been waiting for the fight. The details bent and shifted in retelling, but one truth remained constant. 5 men had cornered one woman, and 30 seconds later, they were all on the ground. For the aftermath was different. He knew the signs. He knew what he'd witnessed. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a reminder. You don't pick fights with people whose silence you don't understand. That evening, he found her on the perimeter road, running at a steady pace as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Her strides were smooth, even, the rhythm of someone who carried distance the way others carried breath. He caught up beside her, lungs burning harder than he wanted to admit. "You could handle that differently," he said, not accusation, not warning, just truth. Her gaze stayed forward, her pace never faltering. "And let them think they were right about me," she shook her head. "Sometimes walking away buys you more than it costs, but sometimes it just invites them to try harder next time." They ran in silence for a stretch, the only sound their footfalls and the cooling night air. Studied her profile, the scar along her jaw catching the last light. He understood now why her presence had unsettled him from the beginning. She wasn't here for them. She was here because the world outside didn't know what to do with her. "They're going to make noise about this," he said finally. "They can make all the noise they want." Her breathing was steady, unlabored. "I've already moved on." He almost admired her certainty, but he'd been around long enough to know noise had consequences. "Doesn't mean they have." She veered off toward the contractor housing, her pace unbroken. "I'm not looking for trouble, Master Sergeant, but I won't avoid it at the cost of self-respect." He watched her fade into the shadows of the base, her stride unchanging. He wasn't sure whether to respect her resolve or worry about what came next. Trouble had a way of circling back, and when it did, he suspected she'd meet it the same way she had today, calm, controlled, and merciless. By morning the summons arrived, formal, typed, bearing the base commander's seal. Was ordered to appear at 900, so was as a witness. The MPs too. Mason and his crew were scheduled for separate interviews hours apart to prevent collusion. The investigation had begun. The mess hall incident was no longer rumor. It was official. And in the sterile conference room where truth and consequence collided, the story of 30 seconds was about to be dissected, word by word, frame by frame. But what no one yet understood was that the fight itself was only half the story. The real test was what came after. What could she say that the footage wouldn't already show? That was the question tightening in his chest as she stepped into the conference room the next morning. The space was bare, walls painted in government gray, blinds half drawn against the sun. A long table stretched across the room, its polished surface splitting the officers on one side from those summoned to account on the other. At the head sat Colonel Reeve, clipped hair, clipped words, a reputation for seeing through excuses like smoke. To his right, the base legal advisor, pen tapping a steady rhythm against her notepad. To his left, the senior MP, his arms crossed, expression guarded. Sat 2 chairs down, posture upright, hands folded, as though he knew his role would be to witness, not to save. Took her seat without hesitation. She didn't fidget, didn't cross her arms. Her hands rested neatly on the table, palms folded. Her face was neutral, her eyes steady. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. If she was tired, she carried it like part of her uniform. Colonel Reeve wasted no time. "We've reviewed the footage," he said, his voice measured, stripped of any inflection that might betray his leaning. "It's instructive. You incapacitated 5 soldiers in approximately 28 seconds. Didn't respond. The silence stretched thick, deliberate. The legal advisor leaned forward. "Miss, can you explain for the record what led to this confrontation?" Her answer was even. 5 soldiers surrounded me while I was eating. They blocked the exits, made verbal demands, and initiated physical contact. I acted to remove the threat. The senior MP's brow lifted. "Remove the threat," his tone tested the words. "You did more than remove it, you dismantled it." "They stopped being a threat when they were on the floor," she replied. Reeve's eyes narrowed slightly, as though measuring her restraint against her precision. "You could have called for assistance." "I didn't have time." "And yet," he said, glancing down at his notes. You had time to break one man's nose, drive an elbow into another's solar plexus, execute sweeps, a joint lock and controlled takedowns. Her voice didn't waver. I've trained for worse in less time. The room stilled. Only the fluorescent lights hummed above them. Glanced at her profile, catching the faint scar along her jawline, the way her gaze never flinched. She wasn't just defending her actions. She was laying down truth like stone. The legal advisor's pen stilled. Your file lists you as a temporary civilian contractor. Would you care to clarify your actual background for the record? The moment lingered like a held breath. His answer was measured, factual. Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy SEAL Team 4, currently on medical leave pending discharge status. The silence broke with a shift in the room's current. The legal advisor's expression hardened. The MP leaned back in his chair, exhaling. Colonel Reeves' gaze sharpened, cutting across her like a blade. That information, he said slowly, is not in the personnel system accessible to this base. It's not meant to be. Felt his chest tighten. She said it with such calm inevitability that it almost sounded like an afterthought, but the weight of her words settled like lead. The MP gave a low whistle under his breath. Well, that explains the technique. It explains nothing, she corrected. I didn't fight because I'm a SEAL. I fought because 5 men left me no other option. Spoke before he could stop himself. Sir, I've seen the way those 5 operate. This was coming. She just happened to be the first one to stand her ground. Reeves' eyes snapped to him, sharp warning. Swallowed the rest, but he didn't regret saying it. The colonel folded his hands, his tone clipped. We can't have incidents like this becoming part of the culture here. This is a training environment, not a proving ground for grudges. With respect, said, her voice steady, they made it one. I ended it. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even defiance. It was her truth, delivered without heat. Reeves studied her for a long moment before closing the folder in front of him. For the record, he said, you'll receive a written warning about engagement with enlisted personnel. No further disciplinary action will be taken. The 5 involved will face internal review. It was as clean an exit as anyone could have hoped for. But the looks exchanged around the table told what he already knew. The official record might be closed, but the real story was still alive. Outside, the corridor was quiet, caught up with her falling into step. His voice was low, even. That went better than it could have. Her reply was calm, almost dismissive. I've been in worse rooms. They're not done, he warned. They'll chew on this for weeks, might try to use it later. She gave a faint shrug. Let them. I don't plan on sticking around long enough for it to matter. He studied her face, looking for something beyond the neutrality. You planning on disappearing again? Her eyes stayed forward. I never stopped. He let her go, her words ringing in his head like the echo of a door closing. Back on base, routines resumed. Forklifts rattled through the yard. The motor pool buzzed with drills, but the mess hall carried a new weight. The table by the window sat empty more often than not, as though the room itself remembered what had happened there. The whispers spread, curling through corners like smoke. Recruits who hadn't been there retold the story with the certainty of witnesses. Some left out the details, some added their own. But the bones never changed. 5 men surrounded one woman, and 30 seconds later, they were on the floor. Notice the shift. Conversations grew quieter, laughter less careless. The swagger of certain recruits trimmed at the edges. It was subtle but real. The base itself had absorbed the lesson. Mason and his crew were different, too. Mason still carried his broad-shouldered frame, but his presence had dulled, his swagger replaced with something brittle. Smirk was quieter, almost hesitant. Troy avoided communal spaces altogether, trained harder as though he could sweat away the memory, threw himself into grunt work with a restless energy, anything to avoid reflection. None of them apologized. but their silence was its own kind of confession. For the incident seemed already behind her. She reclaimed her seat by the window, resumed her runs, stacked her trays with the same precision. She neither sought conversation nor avoided it. Her life moved with the same deliberate rhythm as before. But knew better. Trouble had only shifted shape. Stories like this never stayed contained within one base, and was not the kind of name that stayed quiet for long. One afternoon, a visiting Navy officer stopped by the supply yard, salt and pepper hair, insignia half obscured by his jacket. He watched her for a long moment before saying, "Petty officer." She froze only for a fraction of a second before turning. Her face stayed neutral, but her eyes betrayed something couldn't quite read. Recognition. History. The officer smiled faintly. "Didn't expect to find you here." Her reply was measured. "I'm here on temporary assignment." The man nodded, but there was weight in his gaze. "We'll talk before I leave." And just like that, he was gone. Watched her movements sharpen afterward, each crate stacked with clipped precision, her breath measured like she was reining something in. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He already knew. The mess hall fight had been the spark, but the fire it had lit was bigger than Fort Red Haven. And soon it was going to find her again. Why did the story refuse to die? 2 weeks had passed since the mess hall incident, but the echoes still lingered. The clatter of trays and hum of voices had returned, yet under it all, a silence lived in the room, an invisible scar. New recruits sat down without knowing why certain tables were left untouched. Old hands gave them looks sharp enough to explain without words. The official record was closed. The commander had issued his warnings, the MPs had written their reports, the disciplinary actions had been filed. But base culture doesn't move on at the pace of paperwork. It carries its own memory, stubborn and unfiltered. Kept her routines. Same morning runs, same quiet seat by the window, same precision in the supply yard. On the surface, she was unchanged. But notice the small shifts. The way her gaze lingered half a second longer on certain doorways. The way her runs stretched farther toward the perimeter road, like she needed distance the base couldn't give. She was steady, but steadiness can hide strain. The 5 recruits carried their own changes. Mason still had his broad shoulders and square jaw, but his voice in group settings came out softer, as if he'd learned the weight of silence. Smirk appeared less often, dulled at the edges. Troy kept to himself, working long shifts to avoid the spaces where people gathered. Threw himself into training, chasing discipline like a cure. Carried his wiry energy into grunt work, first to volunteer, last to leave. None of them said the word apology, but their altered behaviors were their confession. Yet outside the base, the story was already mutating. Rumors travel faster than orders. Visiting logistics officers mentioned it in passing. Their words dipped in curiosity. Air Force personnel watched her with a quiet recognition that had nothing to do with gossip. And then the man in khakis appeared, the Navy officer who spoke her name like a password. Petty officer. Had seen the exchange, the pause in her breath. The way her eyes locked with his like an unfinished conversation had just resumed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He knew the Navy didn't let people like her drift for long. Within days, more visitors arrived. Some wore uniforms, some didn't. They logged their presence as joint coordination or supply evaluation, but had been in the Army long enough to know when faces didn't match the paperwork. They passed her in the yard, their glances a fraction too long, their nods too knowing. The pattern was obvious. She was being reclassified in silence, from contractor to asset, from background to someone whose absence carried weight. And then one morning, a sealed envelope slid under her door. Saw her in the mess hall later, seated at her usual table, eyes scanning a short block of text. She folded the paper once, slid it into her pocket and carried on eating. From 2 tables away, caught her glance, the faintest shake of her head, telling him not here, not now. It wasn't until dusk that he found her outside the motor pool, the air cool, the yard quiet. She leaned against a crate, her expression unreadable. "Transfer orders," she said simply, "effective immediately." He nodded slowly, waiting for her to say more. She didn't. "Where?" he asked. She shook her head. "Doesn't matter." He studied her face, the calm mask that had unsettled him since the day she arrived. "Guess that means I won't have to worry about you causing trouble anymore." Her eyes flicked to his, a ghost of a smile there and gone. "I didn't cause trouble, Master Sergeant, I ended it." He almost smiled back. Almost, but worry pressed against the edges of his respect. The paperwork would read one way, the truth was something else, and the truth had a way of following people. The next morning she was in the yard early, her duffel slung over one shoulder. She signed off on final checklists with the same precision she'd shown from day one. No wasted steps, no lingering. A few staff members came by to shake her hand, their gestures short, respectful, wordless. Mason and his crew stayed out of sight, whether out of shame or relief, no one could say. By 900, a black SUV rolled through the gate, no unit markings, windows tinted. It stopped by the admin building, engine running. The driver didn't step out. The rear door opened. She walked toward it without looking back. Her duffel shifted on her shoulder, her stride steady, her face calm. She slid into the backseat, the door shut, and the SUV rolled away. The dust from its tires settled quickly, as though she'd never been there at all. But Fort Red Haven was not the same. Watched from the shade of the motor pool, the she'd favored so often. The table by the window in the mess hall sat empty. Recruits still whispered about the 30 seconds. Conversations still carried hesitation where arrogance once lived. Discipline had sharpened, not because of new rules but because of memory. He sat at her old table once just to see what she'd seen. The angles, the exits, the way the light fell without glare. It was a detail you only noticed after someone taught you to. Had left, but her presence remained, not as a name on a roster, not as a mark on a file, but as a change in the air, invisible yet undeniable. For it was proof, proof that some people alter places without trying, proof that silence can rewrite rules louder than any speech, proof that 30 seconds can live longer than 30 years of routine. And somewhere beyond the gate, wherever that SUV was taking her, she was already slipping into another room, another mission, another silence. She wouldn't carry trophies. She wouldn't chase recognition. But she would leave behind the same thing she left here, an unshakable reminder that quiet is not weakness and dignity does not ask permission. Where did the SUV take her? No one at Fort Red Haven ever found out. It rolled out through the gate, tires whispering over asphalt, and by the time the dust settled, she was already gone. To the paperwork, she was a transfer. To those who had seen her move, she was something else entirely, unfinished business wrapped in silence. The story, though, refused to leave. In the weeks after her departure, it spread beyond the perimeter fence, carried by whispers in chow lines and smoke breaks, by visiting officers who tucked it into conversations as if trading passwords. The details bent and warped. Some said she was an undercover officer. Some swore she was still on base working deep cover security. A few stripped the story down to its bare bones. 5 against 1, 30 seconds, silence as a weapon. The legend grew faster than the truth could catch it. Felt it everywhere. In the mess hall, where the table by the window still sat strangely empty, as if the room itself had claimed it in her name. In the training fields, where recruits carried themselves with a fraction more discipline, their voices quieter, their laughter tempered by caution. In the barracks, where swagger softened into silence and silence into respect. He saw it in Mason and his crew most of all. Mason's broad-shouldered confidence hadn't vanished, but it had turned inward, stripped of its careless edge. Smirk showed itself rarely, and when it did, it faded quickly like a joke told half-heartedly. Troy avoided groups altogether, losing himself in extra duties. Drilled harder, his sweat an act of penance. Channeled his restless energy into grunt work, his silence louder than his laughter had ever been. None of them spoke about her. They didn't need to. Their changed behavior was confession enough. But while Fort Red Haven learned its lesson, was already carving her silence somewhere else. The SUV delivered her to a city where doors stayed locked from both sides. A building without a nameplate, its windows shaded, its hallways sterile and unmarked. Inside, she sat across from men and women who asked questions without asking. They slid a sealed folder across the table, their expressions giving nothing away. She opened it, skimmed the contents, closed it again. No questions, no protests, just a nod. Assignments never came to her with fanfare anymore. They arrived like shadows, briefings that weren't called briefings, conversations that weren't logged. The work was quieter now, less about direct action, more about shaping conditions so someone else could succeed. She didn't mind. Noise had never been her language. Precision was. Yet no matter how far she moved, fragments of Red Haven followed her. At a coastal training facility in the Pacific Northwest, she was just another face moving crates in the yard. But one night in the mess hall, she caught whispers, heard about that woman, 5 guys gone in under a minute. They didn't know it was her. They weren't supposed to. She listened without reacting, sipping her coffee as the story twisted in their telling, the facts blurred but the core unbroken. In Eastern Europe, working alongside NATO logistics officers, she overheard a pair of junior soldiers swapping rumors. This time, the woman in the story was an MP, or maybe intel. No one agreed on the details, but every version ended the same: underestimated, surrounded, decisive. She never corrected them. The story didn't belong to her anymore. But in the quiet moments, alone in temporary quarters, the weight of it pressed against her chest. She replayed the 30 seconds not with pride, not with regret, but with a kind of detached inevitability. She hadn't gone looking for it. She hadn't wanted it. But silence only works until someone mistakes it for weakness. And then, silence has to speak. Still, there was something about Red Haven she couldn't shake. Not the fight itself. She'd lived through worse in combat zones where hesitation cost lives. What lingered was his eyes in the doorway, watching, not stepping in. His words afterward, "You could have handled that differently." She thought about that more than once. Could she have? Was there a version where she left the table, walked away, and avoided it altogether? She doubted it. Mason and his crew weren't the kind to let silence stand. They would have followed. They would have pressed until her choices narrowed to the same point. But still, the thought lingered like a splinter. Maybe there had been another path. She carried that splinter into every new room, into every chow hall where she sat with her back to the wall, into every briefing where her name wasn't spoken aloud, into every assignment where she played a role without being told what it was. Words became a shadow she couldn't outrun. You could have handled that differently. Maybe, but maybe not. One rainy night in an unnamed city, she sat across from a contact in a dim steam rising from chipped porcelain cups. The man leaned in, lowering his voice. "They're still telling that story, you know, 5 against 1. She didn't flinch, she didn't smile. She only sipped her coffee, her eyes steady. "Doesn't matter where you go," the man continued. "People remember the ones who don't waste words." Her reply was flat. "They can remember the story, just not the name." He studied her, then leaned back with a faint nod. She left the way she'd left every room at Red Haven, calm, steady, unbothered on the surface. But inside she felt the splinter shift again. The world wasn't going to let her go, not entirely, not while silence could still be mistaken for surrender. And she wondered, not for the first time, how many more times she'd have to remind people of the difference. What happens when your name becomes a rumor? When the details of your life slip from your hands and turn into a story carried by strangers? Had been living with that question ever since the mess hall. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't want it. But recognition had a way of hunting her down anyway, even when cloaked in whispers and half-truths. The SUV had delivered her to a quiet facility tucked against a rain-soaked coastline in the Pacific Northwest. Officially, she was nobody, a contractor moving crates, an extra hand for inventory. Unofficially, she was being watched, measured, judged. The trainers didn't approach her directly, but she saw their eyes flick toward her when she ran drills on the track at dawn. She heard the low conversations fade whenever she entered the mess hall. She felt the space shift around her, the same way it had at Red Haven. Silence has gravity, and hers pulled people off balance without trying. Then the whispers arrived. She was passing the locker room one evening when two recruits spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Did you hear about that woman? 5 guys, down in 30 seconds. "Yeah, but that wasn't here, some other base." Still, they say she never raised her voice, just wrecked them like she'd been waiting. She walked past without breaking stride, but the words clung like damp fabric. Waiting. That wasn't what it had been. She hadn't wanted any of it, but the story was no longer hers to correct. At night in her temporary quarters, she replayed the mess hall in her head. The scrape of chairs, the press of shoulders, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Not with pride, not with regret, with inevitability. Some things can't be avoided once the line is crossed. And yet's words lingered. You could have handled that differently. Could she? The question gnawed at her. In the dark, with no one watching, her jaw tightened against the thought. A week later, she was gone again. Eastern Europe this time. A NATO outpost where her presence was logged as logistics support. She sorted radio equipment, checked manifests, moved through the yard with her same quiet economy. But once again, the ripples followed her. One night, seated in the mess alongside foreign officers, she caught fragments of a story told in accented English. A nameless woman, surrounded, unmoving. Then sudden precision, 5 men dropped before anyone blinked. This version cast her as military police. Another swore she was intelligence. None of them got it right, but all of them leaned closer as the tale was retold, their voices low, their eyes sharp. She kept eating, silent. But inside, her pulse pressed against her ribs, not from fear, but from the knowledge that the rumor was no longer containable. It had left Red Haven, crossed borders, taken root in the kind of places where stories outlast orders. And once again, it wasn't her name being carried. It was her silence. She wondered if that was worse. Assignments blurred together. Safe houses in nameless cities. Briefings held in back rooms with no windows. Sometimes she worked alone. Sometimes with a team of 3 or 4, men and women who carried themselves like she did, quiet, efficient, avoiding the noise. They didn't ask her story. She didn't ask theirs. She left impressions, though, not by choice, but because silence speaks even when you don't want it to. A technician once said to her after a long night of equipment checks, "You remind me of someone who doesn't waste words." She hadn't answered, she never did. But when she lay awake later, staring at ceilings that all looked the same, the words crawled under her skin. "You remind me of someone." Was that who she was now? A reflection of rumor? A ghost carrying fragments of herself from one place to the next, leaving nothing solid behind? Isolation pressed heavier with each move. At Red Haven, she'd had a steady presence, a man who didn't need explanations to see what was in front of him. Now there was no one. Just new faces, new tasks, new exits to map. The absence became a weight she didn't speak of. In moments between assignments, when her duffel sat packed by the door and the clock ticked toward departure, she felt it most. The hollowness of not belonging anywhere. The certainty that no room would ever be hers. One evening in an eastern city, rain drumming against the windows of a safe house, she sat across from a liaison. A man who looked at her with the quiet recognition of someone who knew more than he said. "They're still telling that story," he said, his tone almost casual. 5 against 1. She stared at her coffee, steam curling upward. "People tell stories all the time." "Not like this one. This one spreads." He leaned closer. Doesn't matter where you go, people remember the ones who don't waste words. Her gaze lifted, steady, flat. They can remember the story, just not the name. He studied her for a beat, then nodded as if he understood. But she knew he didn't. No one did. She walked back to her quarters in the rain, the city lights smeared across wet pavement, the splinter in her chest sharper than ever. She wasn't afraid of being known. She was afraid of being remembered wrong. And yet she kept moving, assignment to assignment, room to room, a ghost with a name stripped away, leaving only the silence behind. What she didn't see, what she couldn't, was how deeply that silence was reshaping the places she touched. At Red Haven, laughter was quieter now, arrogance dimmed. At the coastal facility, recruits shifted their seats instinctively to keep walls at their backs. At the NATO outpost, younger soldiers asked fewer careless questions and listened more. She didn't stay long enough to notice, but her absence was teaching as much as her presence ever had. And though she would never admit it, the lesson was starting to cut both ways. What happens when silence is no longer a shield but a weight? That question pressed against as she stepped into yet another nameless safe house, the air stale with cigarettes and damp plaster. The rain outside fell heavy, smearing neon lights into streaks across the windows. She had been moving for months now, Pacific Northwest, Eastern Europe, then further east where cities felt older than memory and every wall carried echoes of war. Each assignment was temporary, each room impersonal, each duffel packed before it had time to gather dust. She didn't mind the motion. It was standing still that hurt. But tonight she wasn't alone. The mission had brought her into a small team, 4 operators, each carrying themselves with the quiet competence of those who'd seen more than they could say. They called themselves by shortened names or none at all. Each kept their voice low, their words clipped. She was used to silence, but shared silence was different. It pressed against her in ways she hadn't expected. They were there for a courier, a man whose briefcase carried information that could tilt balances if it crossed the wrong border, simple in theory, messy in practice. The plan was clear: watch, follow, intercept, no noise, no spectacle. But things rarely unfold the way paper dictates. On the third night of surveillance, rain slicking the cobblestones, the courier changed patterns. Instead of the expected stop, he slipped into an alley, quick, decisive. The team split instinctively, shadowing him from different angles. Took the north end, boots silent against wet pavement. She caught him near a service entrance, fumbling with keys. He wasn't alone. 2 escorts emerged from the shadows, armed, their postures sharp. She froze, the decision point tightening around her chest. Engage now, alone. Or hold, wait for backup, risk him slipping through. The splinter of words returned. You could have handled that differently. But silence isn't hesitation. Silence is control. She stepped forward. The escorts moved first, hands twitching toward weapons. Her body reacted faster. Elbow to one throat, pivot, heel to a knee. A sharp twist of the courier's wrist wrenched the briefcase free before he registered the change. The second escort swung wide, too slow. She caught his arm, dragged him off balance, drove him into the wall. It was quick, controlled, efficient. But not silent. The scuffle echoed against stone, louder than she wanted, too loud. Her team arrived seconds later, guns raised, eyes sharp. The courier was already on the ground, gasping. The escorts groaned, incapacitated, stood above them, breath even, briefcase in hand. The leader of the team, a woman with ice-gray eyes and a scar cutting across her cheek, studied her with a gaze that wasn't judgment but recognition. You don't wait long, do you? Handed her the briefcase. Waiting gives them time. Gray eyes nodded once, accepting it, but her expression carried weight, something between admiration and warning. The exfiltration was clean. By dawn, the courier was someone else's problem, the briefcase locked in a different set of hands. The team dispersed like shadows at sunrise, each vanishing down their own corridors. but the moment lingered with. In the quiet afterward, sitting alone in yet another temporary room, she felt the isolation heavier than before. Not because she'd fought. That part was inevitable. But because when the moment came, she hadn't hesitated. She hadn't waited for backup. She hadn't trusted anyone else to close the gap. And for the first time, she wondered if silence had hardened into something else, into a wall she couldn't see past. She remembered again. His steady presence at Red Haven, his voice carrying not accusation but a truth she hadn't wanted to hear. You could have handled that differently. Back then she dismissed it, but now, watching rain streak the window, she let the question hang. Was her silence strength, or was it armor she no longer knew how to take off? The story still followed her. At the next day she caught another whisper. 5 against 1, someone murmured. A different country, a different tongue, but the same bones of the story. It wasn't her name they carried anymore. It was the legend of silence, the woman who didn't speak until action forced her hand. And for the first time, wondered if the story was no longer about her at all. Perhaps it belonged to the people who needed it, soldiers who needed to believe in quiet strength, recruits who needed to see dignity without noise. But where did that leave her? She finished her coffee, stood, and walked out into the city. The rain had eased, leaving the streets slick and glistening. She pulled her hood up, blended into the crowd, her figure swallowed by movement. Alone again, always alone. And still, she carried the weight of silence like a second skin. What she couldn't see was that her story, twisted, reshaped, retold, was already preparing to meet her again. Not in whispers this time, not in half-truths, but in a moment that would demand an answer she had avoided for years. Because silence can protect you, silence can teach. But sometimes silence has to break. What happens when silence can't protect you anymore? That question sat with as the weeks folded into one another, as assignments blurred, as stories spread faster than orders. She was no longer a name on a roster. She was a rumor, a ghost, a lesson whispered in chow halls and barracks far from where it began. She hadn't chosen it, but she couldn't escape it either. The mission that finally brought it all back began in a desert outpost, the kind where sand chewed at engines and wind erased footprints by dawn. She was there under another paper-thin title, just another pair of hands in logistics. But the outpost carried echoes she hadn't expected. One evening in the mess hall she heard it again, the story, this time told by a young recruit, his voice loud enough to carry across tables. 5 against 1, she didn't even flinch. 30 seconds and they were all down. Another recruit leaned in. Yeah, I heard she was a SEAL or CIA. No one really knows. Laughter followed, not cruel but nervous, the kind that hides all. Sat alone at the far end, her fork still, her gaze steady. She said nothing. She never did. But inside the splinter twisted. They weren't talking about her anymore. They were talking about an idea, a ghost of her silence. That night she walked the perimeter road alone. The desert stretched endless under a sky bruised with stars. And for the first time, she asked herself if it had been right all along. You could have handled that differently. But then, as the night carried its stillness, another truth pressed in. Maybe it had never been about handling it differently. Maybe it had been about what came after, about how silence keeps living when words can't. The mission dropped the next morning. An escort detail, simple on paper. A convoy of aid workers moving supplies through a stretch of road known for more dust than danger. But paper missions rarely tell the truth. 2 hours into the route, the first crack of gunfire split the silence. The convoy jerked to a stop, tires grinding against gravel, dust billowed. The lead vehicle shuddered under impact. Shouts cut through the air. Was out of her seat before thought caught up. Instinct carried her. The aid workers ducked low, their wide eyes locked on her as if she was supposed to have answers. Maybe she was. The escorts scrambled for cover, returning fire from behind doors and sandbags. But the ambush was sharp, coordinated. Whoever was out there wasn't improvising. They knew the route. They knew the timing. Scanned the ridge, eyes cutting through the haze. Shapes moved disciplined, not scattered. This wasn't a warning shot. It was an intent to erase. She felt the silence settle inside her, steadying her pulse. Noise outside, stillness within. The same stillness that had carried her through the mess hall, through alleys, through missions with no names. But this time it wasn't just her. The aid workers huddled behind crates. The young recruit from the mess hall crouched nearby, his hands trembling against his rifle. His eyes flicked to her, wide, searching. She saw it in him, the story, the rumor, the ghost he believed in. For a breath she hated it, hated that silence had turned her into something she was, but then she saw what it gave him, not bravado, not arrogance, hope. And that was when she understood. The story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the ones who needed it. She leaned close to the recruit, her voice low, steady, the first words she'd spoken in hours. Focus. Breathe, one target at a time. His breath slowed, his grip steadied. And then she rose. She moved through dust and gunfire with the same precision she had in the mess hall, in the alleys, in every nameless place she'd left behind. But this time wasn't about 30 seconds or proving anything. This time was about carrying others through the storm. The ridge cleared slower than she wanted, faster than it should have. The attackers retreated, their formation breaking once enough of them hit the ground. Silence fell again, broken only by the ringing in their ears. The convoy survived. No aid workers lost. The recruit alive, though shaken, his rifle still warm in his hands. Stood at the edge of the road, sand whipping around her boots, breath steady. She felt no triumph, only the weight of inevitability. Back at the outpost, the story grew immediately, spreading through tents and radios. She didn't panic, she didn't even raise her voice. She just acted. The recruit told it first, his voice shaking but certain. Others repeated it, trimming details, adding others. And within a day, it was no longer an ambush. It was another parable of silence. Didn't correct them, she didn't need to. That night she sat alone beneath the desert stars, the quiet stretching endless. For the first time in a long time she allowed herself a thin smile, not because of victory, not because of recognition, but because she finally understood what her silence had become. It wasn't armor anymore, it wasn't a cage, it was a mirror, one that showed others what they needed to see: strength, control, dignity without noise. And she knew would have said it differently. He would have argued about choices, about handling things another way. Maybe he would have been right. But sitting there, watching the horizon fade into night, she found her own answer. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.